Today we have some more actual history about a Kiowa Indian raid that took place in northern Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas back in 1866. This was the attack on the Box family, which Fanny Kelly briefly mentioned in her book. Today we will read some more detailed accounts about the Box family massacre. The first comes from this 1939 book by Joseph Carroll McConnell, titled The West Texas Frontier. The author interviewed several relatives and neighbors of the Box family, and he also quotes from a local history book about Montague County, Texas, where the Box family lived. In this book we will also read about the attack on Mr. McDougall, which occurred on the same day. After reading Joseph Carroll McConnell's account of the Box family massacre, we will then read the accounts written by George Armstrong Custer in his book, My Life on the Plains. This book was published all the way back in 1872. Custer interviewed the mother and eldest daughter of the Box family after they had been ransomed from captivity. So here is the tragic story of the Box family massacre in 1866 by Satanta's band of the Kiowa Indians. James J. Box, who lived on the head of Elm in Montague County, near the present city of St. Joe, and who was returning from a trip to eastern Texas, stopped in Gainesville 1 week because of the sickness of his wife. To them a new baby was born, and when the infant was 1 week old, Mr. Box and family again resumed their journey homeward. James J. Box and wife Mary, and daughters Margaret, Marzie, Ida, and Laura, the 7-days-old baby, left Gainesville on August 6, 1866, the same day William McDougall was killed. When they reached a point about 3 miles east of their home, approximately 32 Indians murdered Mr. Box and made captives of his wife and children. Charlie and William Grant, John Loren, and Zeke Hoffman rode upon a hill to look over the surrounding country, and to their surprise saw 7 or 8 Indians going toward a wagon. In a short time, other Indians were seen. 32 Indians were then counted. Charlie and William Grant, like their 2 associates, were only armed with cap and ball pistols, and they had already discharged their loads at some young frying-sized turkeys, and Loren and Hoffman were riding young ponies. So the boys decided they were in no condition to charge such a large number of Indians. As a consequence, they returned to their homes, and conveyed the startling news. Cherry, accompanied by a black man named Jack Loren, and perhaps 1 or 2 others, hurried to the scene where the Indians charged the Box family, and discovered where the Indians had opened the feather beds as usual for the ticking. They also saw considerable leather on the ground that Mr. Box was bringing from eastern Texas to the local frontier citizens for the purpose of making shoes. So the tragedy had evidently occurred at this place, but up until this time the body of Mr. Box had not been found. But after riding around the wagon 3 times, the citizens located Mr. Box lying in the broomweeds, which were white with feathers. When the Indians were killing Mr. Box, his wife Mary Box and her 18-year-old daughter Margaret, 11-year-old Marzie, and 7-year-old daughter Ida, in hysterical frights, left the wagon, and were hurrying to and fro in agony, although Mrs. Box was hardly able to be out of bed. With her infant baby hovered to her breast, she was tied on a wild horse, and Mrs. Box and daughter started on a long journey toward northern Oklahoma or Kansas. Mrs. Box reported that 19 Indians carried them away, but Charlie Grant stated that 32 Indians were counted around the wagon. It is possible, however, that these other Indians may have gone in a different direction. When they had gone a considerable distance, Mrs. Box's horse appeared to be somewhat fatigued, and was slowing down. So an Indian punched the animal in the side with a spear, which caused the pony to jump. When he did, Mrs. Box dropped her 1-week-old baby. She then whirled her horse to pick it up, but was prevented by the Indians, who murdered the infant child in the most brutal manner, and before the eyes of its mother, who was already suffering inconceivable agony. Concerning the experience of Mrs. Box and her daughters while they were in the hands of the Indians, we take the following quotation from the History of Montague County by Mrs. W. R. Potter. Mrs. Box, who afterwards became the wife of Captain Brunson, told the following story of their thrilling experience with the Indians. After killing her husband, they tied her on a wild horse and speared him to make him plunge. The plunging of the horse caused her to drop her baby. The Indians picked the poor little thing up and killed her before her mother's eyes, and took the party on across the Red River. There were 19 Indians in the band. They refused to give Mrs. Box water, although she was so thirsty her tongue was swollen from her mouth. One of her daughters took off her slipper and filled it with water as they crossed a stream. She gave it to her mother. Her mother managed to drink it before the Indians could dash it from her lips. They took a leather quirt and beat the daughter almost to death for this act of kindness to her heartbroken mother. The Indians separated the family, putting them in different camps. The little girl, 8 years old, would cry and run after the other members of the family when she would see them. The Indians held her feet to the fire until they were blistered, so she could not follow her mother and sister. It is hard to realize such barbarous acts ever took place in this county, but all the cruelties the early settlers suffered at the hands of the Indians will never be known. Due to the patriotic efforts of F.M. Williams, Governor J.W. Throckmorton, and others who worked through the Indian agents and military authorities, plans were perfected whereby Mrs. Box and her daughters were ransomed from the Indians a few months after they had been captured. They were in the hands of the Kiowas, who roamed over the Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma, Kansas, and elsewhere. Note: author personally interviewed Charlie Grants mentioned above, George Jones, who married a niece of Mrs. Box, and her daughter several times visited Mr. Jones and his wife after they were returned from the hands of the Indians. Author also interviewed F.R. McCracken, W.A. Bud Morris, Joe Bryant, Joe Savage, and others. For further reference, see a report made by William Fanning, County Judge of Montague County, by Mrs. W.R. Porter, and see Hunter's Magazine, October 1911. So that was the account of the massacre of the Box family from Joseph McConnell's 1939 book, West Texas Frontier. He also quoted from Mrs. W.R. or Fanny Potter's 1939 book, History of Montague County. We will now read about another attack which occurred on the same day, August 5, 1866, but this attack occurred far to the southwest of the Box Family Massacre, in Menard County, Texas, along the San Saba River. Here's the story of the attack on William McDougall and his family. August 5, 1866, the cowmen who lived in Menard County and elsewhere rounded up about 5,000 head of cattle, which were herded about 10 miles east of Old Fort McCavett. When the day's work was done, William McDougall rode to his home about 1.5 miles east of the above post, and spent the night. Next morning he saddled his pony, and started out alone toward the herd, but only went about 1 mile, when several Indians charged upon him. William McDougall ran about 1 mile and swam the San Saba River, but was finally overtaken and killed. The Indians shortly afterwards came upon Clara Schulenberger, a stepdaughter of William McDougall. Clara was returning from the garden, which was about 1/4 mile from the house. Miss Schulenberger was almost home when the Indians reached her, and she had her arms full of cantaloupes. She could not see very well, so Clara at first thought the Indians were cowmen. Finally she said, "Oh, mother, they will get me!" She ran and fell over the fence into the yard, and the Indians lanced her just as she went over the fence. Mrs. McDougall, who had not realized her husband was slain, and who was unprotected at the home, made all the disturbance possible to cause these Indians to think several men were in the house. Mrs. McDougall succeeded in frightening the Indians away, and saved her wounded daughter from further injury. The Indians on this raid drove away approximately 5,000 head of cattle. During this particular invasion, as well as others, we are inclined to believe that white cow thieves of New Mexico and elsewhere were cooperating with the Indians who stole so many cattle on this occasion. In the first place, the Indians had no particular incentive to steal so many stock, and in the second place, John Hitson of Palo Pinto County and others, who were sent to the West for that purpose during the dark days of Reconstruction, discovered many Texas cattle in New Mexico. These cattle had been driven away by the Indians, who were no doubt hired by cow thieves. On these major raids, when such immense herds were captured by the Indians on the San Saba, Pecos, and elsewhere, the cattle were so often later found on the great western ranches of New Mexico. Note: author personally interviewed Mrs. Ben Ellis, a granddaughter of Mrs. McDougall. J.D. Carlisle, who in company with John Ringer, were the first to find Mr. McDougall. Mrs. J.D. Carlisle and Mr. and Mrs. J.F.P. Cruz, Ben Ellis, and others who lived in this section of the state, at the time and shortly afterwards. So that story mentioned an interesting aspect of these Indian raids, which occurred just after the end of the Civil War. The horses and cattle stolen during these raids often ended up in New Mexico, and there may have been cattle thieves working with the Indians or giving them money for the horses and cattle that were stolen. We will now read General George Armstrong Custer's account of the Box Family Massacre. The most prominent chiefs in council were Satanta, Lone Wolf, and Kicking Bird of the Kiowas, and Little Raven and Yellow Bear of the Arapahoes. During the council, extravagant promises of future good conduct were made by these chiefs. So effective and convincing was the oratorical effort of Satanta that at termination of his address, the department commander and staff presented him with a uniform coat, sash, and hat of a major general. In return for this compliment, Satanta, within a few weeks after, attacked the post at which the council was held, arrayed in his new uniform. This said chief had but recently headed an expedition to the frontier of Texas, where, among other murders committed by him and his band, was that known as the Box Massacre. The Box family consisted of father, mother, and 5 children, the eldest a girl about 18, the youngest a babe. The entire family had been visiting at a neighbor's house, and were returning home in the evening, little dreaming of the terrible fate impending, when Satanta and his warriors dashed upon them, surrounded the wagon in which they were driving, and at the first fire killed the father and one of the children. The horses were hastily taken from the wagon, while the mother was informed by signs that she and her 4 surviving children must accompany their captors. Mounting their prisoners upon led horses, of which they had a great number stolen from the settlers, the Indians prepared to set out on their return to the village, then located hundreds of miles north. Before departing from the scene of the massacre, the Indians scalped the father and child who had fallen as their first victims. Far better would it have been had the remaining members of the family met their death in the first attack. From the mother whom I met when released from her captivity, after living as a prisoner in the hands of the Indians for more than a year, I gathered the details of the sufferings of herself and children. Fearing pursuit by the Texans and desiring to place as long a distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers, they prepared for a night march. Mrs. Box and each of the 3 elder children were placed on separate horses and securely bound. This was to prevent escape in the darkness. The mother was at first permitted to carry the youngest child, a babe of a few months, in her arms, but the latter, becoming fretful during the tiresome night ride, began to cry. The Indians, fearing the sound of its voice might be heard by pursuers, snatched it from its mother's arms and dashed its brains out against a tree, then threw the lifeless remains to the ground, and continued their flight. No halt was made for 24 hours, after which the march was conducted more deliberately. Each night the mother and 3 children were permitted to occupy one shelter, closely guarded by their watchful enemies. After traveling for several days, this war party arrived at the point where they rejoined their lodges. They were still a long distance from the main village, which was near the Arkansas. Each night the scalp of the father was hung up in the lodge occupied by the mother and children. A long and weary march over a wild and desolate country brought them to the main village. Here the captives found that their most serious troubles were to commence. In accordance with Indian custom, upon the return of a successful war party, a grand assembly of the tribe took place. The prisoners' captured horses and scalps were brought forth, and the usual ceremonies, terminating in a scalp dance, followed. Then the division of the spoils was made. The captives were apportioned among the various bands composing the tribe, so that when the division was completed, the mother fell to the possession of one chief, the eldest daughter to that of another, the second, a little girl of probably 10 years, to another, and the youngest, a child of 3 years, to a fourth. No 2 members of the family were permitted to remain in the same band, but each were carried to separate villages, distant from each other several days' march. This was done partly to prevent escape. No pen can describe the painful tortures of mind and body endured by this unfortunate family. They remained as captives in the hands of the Indians for more than a year, during which time the eldest daughter, a beautiful girl just ripening into womanhood, was exposed to a fate infinitely more dreadful than death itself. She first fell to one of the principal chiefs, who, after robbing her of that which was more precious than life, and forcing her to become the victim of his brutal lust, bartered her in return for 2 horses to another chief. He again, after wearying of her, traded her to a chief of a neighboring band, and in that way this unfortunate girl was passed from one to another of her savage captors, undergoing a life so horribly brutal that when meeting her upon her release from captivity, one could only wonder how a young girl nurtured in civilization and possessed of the natural refinement and delicacy of thought which she exhibited, could have survived such degrading treatment. The mother and second daughter fared somewhat better. The youngest, however, separated from mother and sisters, and thrown among people totally devoid of all kind feeling, spent the time in shedding bitter tears. This so enraged the Indians that, as a punishment, as well as preventive, this child was seized and the soles of her naked feet exposed to the flames of the lodge fire, until every portion of the cuticle was burned therefrom. When I saw this little girl a year afterward, her feet were from this cause still in a painful and unhealed condition. These poor captives were reclaimed from their bondage through the efforts of officers of the army, and by the payment of a ransom amounting to many hundreds of dollars. The facts relating to their cruel treatment were obtained by me directly from the mother and eldest daughter, immediately after their release, which occurred a few months prior to the council held with Satanta and the other chiefs. So that's it for this episode about the massacre of the Box family in Montague County, Texas in August of 1866. George Custer said that they were held captive for a year, but other accounts state that they were rescued in October of 1866. It could be that they stayed at military forts for some time to recover after their rescue, and that was when Custer met the mother and eldest daughter, and when he noticed the unhealed wounds on the youngest daughter Ida's feet. Joseph Carroll McConnell mentioned that Mrs. Box later married a Mrs. Brunson. However, this appears to have been the oldest daughter, Margaret, who married a Mr. Brunson. They lived in Terry, Montana for many years, until she died in 1920. The mother, Mrs. Mary Box, appears to have died in 1867, and the second oldest daughter, Marzie Box, died in 1875 in Decatur, Texas, at just 22 years of age. There is little information on Ida Box, the youngest girl whose feet were burned by the Kiowas. She may have died at a young age as well, leaving only the oldest daughter, Margaret, to survive to old age from the Box family. It was likely the Comanches or Kickapoo Indians who killed William McDougall on the same day, August 6, 1866, far to the southwest on the San Saba River. So the Texas settlers were getting attacked by multiple tribes all along the western frontier during this time. Let us know what you think about these events in the comments below. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, we are devoted to keeping this worthy history of our ancestors alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. We have also recently started the Unworthy History podcast, where these episodes will be re-released, and it's possible that we may release some episodes exclusively on the podcast in the future, so please consider following our podcast. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.